Picture yourself walking through the sacred precincts of an ancient temple, surrounded by thousands of worshippers prostrating themselves before a figure seated on a golden throne. But this isn't what you'd expect to see. The object of their veneration isn't a marble statue of Venus or Athena, but a living, breathing 14-year-old boy, draped in flowing silk robes, adorned with jewelry fit for the gods, and forced to accept the prayers and offerings of an entire empire that believes him to be a divine goddess incarnate. This impossible scene wasn't fantasy or mythology. This was the reality in the Roman Empire of the 2nd century. And this is the extraordinary story of Sporus, a beautiful young boy who was surgically altered, psychologically conditioned, and systematically transformed into a living goddess by the most powerful and deranged emperor in history. Our story begins not in the marble halls of imperial palaces, but in the humble countryside of rural Italy, where a boy named Sporus lived an ordinary life that gave no hint of the nightmare that awaited him. Born around 50 AD to a family of modest means, Sporus was remarkable only for his extraordinary beauty. Ancient historians describe him as having delicate, almost feminine features, large, expressive eyes, smooth skin that seemed to glow in sunlight, and a slender build that made him appear almost ethereal. In a different time and place, his beauty might have led to a career as an actor or artist's model. Instead, it would make him the target of an emperor's twisted obsession and transform him into something that had never existed before in human history. A boy forced to become a goddess. Everything changed in 64 AD, when Emperor Nero's beloved wife, Poppaea Sabina, died under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed she had been kicked to death by Nero himself during a violent argument, though the official story blamed complications from pregnancy. Whatever the truth, Nero's grief was immediate and overwhelming. But this wasn't normal mourning. It was something far more disturbing. The emperor became obsessed with finding a way to bring Poppaea back, or, failing that, to find someone who could take her place in the most literal sense possible. It was during this period of imperial madness that Nero's agents scoured the empire looking for young men who bore any resemblance to his dead wife. When they discovered Sporus, then 14 years old, they knew they had found what the emperor was seeking. The boy's delicate features, combined with his slight build and natural grace, made him an almost perfect physical match for Poppaea in her youth. But Nero's plans for Sporus went far beyond simple resemblance. He intended to transform this child into an exact replica of his dead wife, not just in appearance, but in identity, role, and ultimately, in religious significance. What happened next represents one of the most horrific examples of absolute power corrupting absolutely in all of human history. Nero ordered that Sporus undergo surgical castration, not just to prevent him from developing masculine characteristics as he matured, but as part of a complete physical transformation designed to make him as feminine as possible. This wasn't simply about changing his appearance. It was about erasing his male identity entirely and replacing it with something else. The surgery was performed by imperial physicians using techniques that were primitive and dangerous by any standard, and the boy barely survived the procedure. But the physical transformation was only the beginning of Sporus's nightmare. Nero assigned teams of specialists to work on every aspect of the boy's conversion into a living replica of Poppaea. His voice was trained by professional vocal coaches until he could speak in the high, melodious tones that Poppaea had been famous for. His movements were choreographed by dance masters until he walked, gestured, and even breathed in ways that mimicked the dead empress. His facial expressions were studied and modified until he could reproduce Poppaea's smile, her laugh, even her way of tilting her head when listening to someone speak. The psychological conditioning was perhaps even more brutal than the physical alterations. Sporus was forbidden from using his birth name or acknowledging his male identity in any way. He was required to respond only to Poppaea and to think of himself as female at all times. Any slip back into masculine behavior was severely punished, while successful feminine performance was rewarded with luxury and praise. Teams of servants worked around the clock to maintain the illusion, applying cosmetics, styling his hair, dressing him in the finest silks and jewelry that had once belonged to the real Poppaea. Within months, the transformation was so complete that Sporus had begun to lose track of his original identity. The constant reinforcement, combined with the trauma of his situation and his youth, created a psychological condition where he genuinely began to believe he was Poppaea reborn. This was unjust acting. It was a form of induced dissociation, where his original personality was systematically erased and replaced with an artificial one based on a dead woman he had never met. But Nero's obsession didn't stop at creating a physical and psychological replica of his dead wife. In 67 AD, he took the unprecedented step of actually marrying Sporus in a formal ceremony that shocked Roman society to its core. This was not a symbolic gesture or private ritual. It was a full imperial wedding, complete with religious ceremonies, legal documentation, and public celebration. Roman law had no provision for marriage between two males, and the idea of an emperor marrying a castrated boy was so far outside normal Roman experience that many contemporaries questioned Nero's sanity. The wedding ceremony itself was designed to emphasize Sporus's role as a reborn goddess, rather than simply a replacement wife. He was dressed in the sacred robes traditionally worn by the goddess Venus, adorned with jewelry that had religious rather than merely decorative significance. And the entire event was structured around the concept that Nero was marrying not just a person, but a divine incarnation. Priests declared that the goddess Poppaea had returned to Earth in new form, and that the emperor's marriage to this divine being would bring special blessings to the entire empire. Following the wedding, Nero began displaying Sporus throughout the empire, not as his wife, but as a living goddess who deserved worship and veneration. Temples were constructed in major cities, specifically for the worship of Poppaea reborn, and citizens were expected to make offerings and prayers to Sporus, as they would to any traditional deity. The boy who had once played in Italian countryside was now the center of an official religious cult that stretched across the known world. The psychological impact on Sporus of this transformation from boy to goddess was devastating and profound. Ancient sources suggest that by this point, he had lost almost all connection to his original identity and genuinely believed himself to be divine. The constant worship, the elaborate rituals, and the systematic reinforcement of his goddess status had created a form of religious psychosis, where he experienced himself as actually possessing supernatural powers and divine knowledge. But the empire's acceptance of Sporus as a goddess was unjust the result of imperial decree. It reflected deeper currents in Roman religious thinking that made such a transformation psychologically possible for both the goddess and her worshippers. Romans were already familiar with concepts of divine incarnation, where gods could take human form, and with mystery religions that promised direct contact with divine beings. The idea that a goddess might choose to inhabit a human body, even a male one that had been appropriately modified, wasn't entirely outside Roman religious experience. What made Sporus's situation unique wasn't the concept of divine incarnation itself, but the deliberate, systematic way in which a human being had been transformed to serve that role. This wasn't a spontaneous religious experience or a gradual recognition of divine nature. It was an engineered transformation designed to meet one man's psychological needs and then imposed on an entire empire through political authority. The worship of Sporus as Poppaea became increasingly elaborate and institutionalized as Nero's reign progressed. Professional priests developed complex liturgies for his worship, complete with sacred texts describing his divine powers and miraculous abilities. Pilgrims traveled from across the empire to seek audiences with the living goddess, bringing offerings and prayers for healing, fertility, and divine favor. The economic impact of the cult became enormous, with entire industries developing around the production of religious artifacts, the accommodation of pilgrims, and the performance of ritual services. Yet beneath this impressive religious facade, Sporus himself was trapped in an increasingly impossible psychological situation. As he matured from 14 to 16 to 18, the physical and emotional strain of maintaining his goddess persona became more and more difficult. The surgical modifications that had feminized his appearance as a young teenager became less effective as he aged, requiring constant medical interventions and cosmetic treatments to maintain the illusion. More importantly, the psychological dissociation that had allowed him to function as Poppaea reborn began to break down as his natural personality. Development conflicted with his imposed divine identity. Ancient historians hint that by 68 AD, Sporus was beginning to experience what we might recognize today as severe psychological distress. The constant performance of divinity, the inability to express his authentic self, and the growing awareness of his trapped situation created a mental crisis that even the most sophisticated imperial physicians could not address. He began having episodes where he would revert to his original personality, speaking in his natural voice and using his birth name, before being forcibly returned to his goddess role through a combination of drugs, psychological pressure, and threats. The crisis reached its peak when military rebellions broke out across the empire in 68 AD, threatening Nero's hold on power. As the political situation deteriorated, Sporus found himself in an incredibly vulnerable position. He was both too valuable to abandon, as the centerpiece of an empire-wide religious cult, and too dangerous to protect, since his very existence was evidence of Nero's mental instability and religious innovations that many Romans found deeply offensive. When Nero finally fled Rome with a small group of loyal supporters, Sporus was among them. Even facing death, the emperor couldn't abandon his living goddess, though by this point the boy's psychological state had deteriorated to the point where he required constant care and supervision. The transformation that had made him a goddess had also made him completely dependent on the imperial system that had created him. Nero's suicide in June 68 AD left Sporus in an impossible situation. He was simultaneously one of the most famous people in the Roman Empire, worshipped as a goddess by millions, and one of the most vulnerable, having no legal identity, no family connections, and no practical skills beyond his performance of divinity. What followed was perhaps even more tragic than what had come before. The new emperor, Galba, initially attempted to dissolve the cult of Sporus Poppaea and return the boy to some kind of normal life. But the transformation had been too complete. Sporus no longer remembered how to be anything other than a goddess, and the empire's religious infrastructure had become too invested in his divine status to simply abandon the cult. Instead of freedom, Sporus found himself passed from one powerful man to another, each attempting to use his religious significance for their own political purposes. Under the brief reign of Otho, Sporus was forced to continue his role as a living goddess, though the new emperor had little personal investment in maintaining the elaborate fiction that Nero had created. The religious ceremonies continued, the temples remained active, and pilgrims still came seeking divine favor. But the passionate conviction that had driven the cult's creation was gone. Sporus had become a religious artifact, maintained because it was easier than dismantling the entire system that had grown up around him. When Vitellius became emperor, later in 68 AD, he decided to use Sporus for what he considered the ultimate entertainment, a public spectacle. In the Colosseum, where the living goddess would be sexually humiliated before thousands of spectators as part of a mythological reenactment. For Vitellius, this represented the perfect way to demonstrate his rejection of Nero's religious innovations, while providing the Roman mob with a spectacle that combined sex, violence, and the destruction of false gods. For Sporus, the prospect of this final degradation represented the complete destruction of everything that remained of his constructed identity. The goddess persona that had been his prison for 4 years had also become his only refuge from the trauma of his transformation. To be publicly stripped of even that artificial dignity, to be reduced to an object for mass entertainment, was more than his fractured psyche could endure. Rather than submit to this ultimate humiliation, Sporus made the only choice that was truly his own in years. He committed suicide, probably by poison. Sometime in early 69 AD, he was no more than 19 years old. In death, he finally escaped the impossible role that had consumed his adolescence and young adulthood, though even his suicide was interpreted by some as a final divine act, the goddess choosing to return to the heavens rather than submit to mortal degradation. The cult of Sporus Poppaea didn't survive his death. Without the physical presence of the living goddess, the entire religious structure that Nero had created collapsed within months. Temples were closed, priests found other employment, and the extensive literature describing his divine powers was largely destroyed. The transformation that had seemed so permanent and significant proved to be entirely dependent on the continued existence of its central figure. What makes Sporus' story so deeply disturbing isn't just the abuse he suffered, but the way his individual humanity was completely erased in service of other people's needs and fantasies. From the moment Nero decided he could serve as a replacement for Poppaea, Sporus ceased to exist as a person and became instead a canvas for imperial obsession, religious innovation, and political manipulation. The boy who had been born with a name, a family, and presumably his own dreams and hopes, disappeared so completely that we know almost nothing about his original personality or desires. The transformation was so thorough that even sympathetic ancient historians, writing about his story, focused primarily on what was done to him, rather than who he was as an individual. We know extensive details about his surgical modification, his religious training, and his role in imperial ceremonies, but virtually nothing about his thoughts, feelings, or inner experience of his extraordinary circumstances. Perhaps most tragically, the very completeness of his transformation meant that by the end of his life, even he had lost access to his original identity. The psychological conditioning that made him an effective goddess also made it impossible for him to return to being the person he had been before his ordeal began. In a very real sense, both the boy Sporus and the goddess Poppaea died when he took his own life. Neither identity was authentic or sustainable outside the artificial system that Nero had created. Modern psychological understanding suggests that what happened to Sporus represents one of the most extreme examples of identity manipulation and psychological abuse in recorded history. The systematic destruction of his original personality, combined with the imposed adoption of an artificial identity based on a dead woman, created a form of dissociative disorder that would have been impossible to treat with ancient medical knowledge. The story of Sporus serves as a powerful reminder that behind every historical narrative of imperial excess and religious innovation, there are individual human costs that are often overlooked or minimized. A 14-year-old boy's life was completely sacrificed to serve one man's grief and obsession, and an entire empire was complicit in treating his transformation as acceptable entertainment and religious spectacle. His story also reveals the arbitrary nature of identity, gender, and even religious belief in the ancient world. That a surgically modified boy could be successfully presented as a goddess, and accepted as such by millions of people, demonstrates both the flexibility of Roman religious thinking and the power of political authority to shape even the most fundamental aspects of human experience. Today, no physical evidence of the cult of Sporus Poppaea survives. The temples built in his honor were destroyed or converted to other uses. The statues were broken up, and the religious texts were deliberately eliminated by later emperors, who wanted to erase all memory of Nero's religious innovations. But the story itself survives, as one of the most haunting examples of how absolute power can corrupt not just political institutions, but the most basic foundations of human identity and dignity. If this story of transformation, abuse, and the ultimate cost of imperial obsession has affected you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Sporus's nightmare do you find most disturbing? The physical modifications forced on a child, the systematic destruction of his original identity, or the way an entire empire was complicit in treating his suffering as religious spectacle? And if you're re-interested in more stories about how individual lives were consumed by the vast machinery of ancient empires, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because history is full of people whose extraordinary suffering and resilience deserve to be remembered, not just as curiosities from the past, but as reminders of our shared humanity and the importance of protecting the vulnerable from those who would use them for their own purposes. Thank you for joining me in exploring one of history's most disturbing tales of power, identity, and the price of being transformed against your will into something you never chose to become.